However, it's not all doom and gloom down Hereford way. One of those original SAS men, Ken Connor, is now a very good friend of us, a sort of honorary uncle to my children. He was the longest serving man in the SAS regiment. Nobody's ever served longer on operational service than Ken. And he was one of the guys who helped devise the bodyguarding techniques the Royalty Protection Group use today, and was also one of the founders of the counter-terrorist wing. Now, at this point, I always have to add the disclaimer that I'm well aware that terrorism is not in the slightest bit funny. But I would also add, as the SS themselves will say, that black humour is a way of diffusing the most unpleasant situations. And you only have to think back to the testicular arrangements of Adolf Hitler in that famous song from the Second World War to realise that. So in that spirit, I offer this tale of Ken, who was, as I say, one of the ones who set up the counter-terrorist wing straight after the Munich Olympics disaster. Now, one of the great things about the SAS is, despite their extraordinary skills in their limited specialist area, they're always willing to take advice from anyone. They have no ego about it. They're willing to listen to anyone who might have a useful idea. And one of the first things Ken did was to write to all the other branches of the special services and police forces and so on, asking for advice and hints, tips, any techniques that might be useful in the fight against terrorism. One of the replies they got came from a dog handler with the Metropolitan Police, who suggested the idea of using attack dogs. Now, attack dogs, as I'm sure you know, are specially bred Alsatians. They've got coats like grizzly bears, jaws like crocodiles, and teeth to match. And as attack dogs, they do exactly what it says on the tin. And since aircraft hijacking was the #1 terrorist threat at the time, Ken set up an exercise to test the attack dogs using the fuselage of an old aircraft that was propped up on oil barrels at the old Biggin Hill airfield in Kent. One of Ken's SAS mates, suitably encased in bite-proof clothing, was to pose as the terrorist. 2 more were to act as his hostages, and 30 or 40 Ministry of Defence bigwigs and senior army officers, there to act as observers, were arranged in rows on folding chairs all the way down the fuselage, just like passengers. Ken took up station to observe the proceedings from the back, and when all was in readiness, the SAS man posing as the terrorist fired a couple of shots, which was the signal for the dog to be released. Next minute, it came hurtling through the doorway. Sadly, it at once became apparent that the dog had not been properly briefed, because instead of attacking the terrorist, he made straight for the audience instead. And I have to say, he went about his business with a thoroughgoing professionalism and indeed an enthusiasm which was a credit to him and his handler. In their desperation to escape the rather unwelcome attentions of the dog, the audience, as one man, jumped to their feet and sprinted towards the front of the plane to try and get away. Unfortunately, in so doing, they rather altered the balance of weight of the plane, and it slipped off a couple of its oil barrels and came to rest nose down at a rather steep angle to the ground. The terrorists, the hostages, and the entire audience were in a heap of bodies and folding chairs at the front. Ken was at the back, having wisely taken the precaution of grabbing hold of the fuselage as it started to tip. Everybody else was at the front, apart from the dog, who, rather puzzled by this unexpected turn of events, sat down on the floor in the middle of the aircraft for a moment, and then, with a sound like chalk squeaking on a blackboard, its claws scraping on the aluminium floor, it began to slide. Slowly at first, but gathering speed as it went, faster and faster, until it disappeared, boom, into the middle of the pile of bodies. The scene that followed would have, I think, delighted the heart of any ordinary soldier from any era. To the accompaniment of the sound of rending Savile Row suits and expensive army uniforms, 30 or 40 Ministry of Defence bigwigs and senior officers were crawling all over each other in their frantic attempts to escape the attentions of a ravening attack dog. When the dog had at last been restrained, order restored, and hot sweet tea or anti-tetanus jabs as appropriate administered to the shocked survivors, it turned out that almost the only person who hadn't received at least one visit from the dog during the preceding debacle was the mock terrorist. Now, I'm sure at that point most of us would have simply given up, but clearly that just goes to prove that we're not SAS material, because they're made of rather sterner stuff. And reasoning that just as every dog has its day, every dog can have an off day too, Ken immediately went ahead and set up another exercise, although admittedly this time on solid ground inside the SAS base at Hereford. The same cast of characters was invited to attend, although this time, for some extraordinary reason, many of the senior army officers and Ministry of Defence officials suddenly remembered pressing prior engagement and sent their deputies instead. This time as well, as an added refinement to test the theory of some mad scientist at Porton Down that dogs were somehow less susceptible to the effects of tear gas than humans, the exercise was to take place in a gas-filled environment. And all the participants and spectators, though not of course the dog, were issued with gas masks. Once more, when all was in readiness, a tear gas canister was detonated and the mock terrorist fired a couple of shots. Once more, the dog came barrelling through the door, and once more, his temper probably not improved by the tear gas, he chose to ignore the terrorist and made straight for the audience to complete some unfinished business. Fortunately, on this occasion, Ken had taken the wise precaution of having the dog's handler in the room with them, and he at once bellowed the command to stop. Sadly, of course, he was wearing a gas mask at the time. And either the dog didn't recognize his voice, or perhaps he did and just chose to ignore it. But in either case, he went merrily on his way. In desperation, the handler tore off his gas mask and was about to shriek the command to stop when he inhaled first, swallowed a lungful of CS gas, and next minute was in a coughing, sobbing heap on the floor. And thus, unencumbered, the dog completed 2 leisurely circuits of the room before he was eventually apprehended and led away. Once more, when the extractor fans had removed the last vestiges of gas from the atmosphere and more hot sweet tea and anti-tetanus jabs had been administered, often for the second time in a few weeks, it emerged that almost the only person who hadn't been visited by the dog was the terrorist. And at that point, even the SAS had seen enough. And from that day to this, neither attack dogs nor their handlers, indeed, have ever been admitted to the regiment.